Hey everyone, Alex here. There's a misconception that big tech employees are special, and I want to talk about that today and dispel a few myths. First of all, I want to assure you that big tech employees, while they can be extraordinary, aren't necessarily special. And I say that as someone who's worked in big tech in various positions from engineering to product management for almost over 10 years at this point. Also, these are just my own opinions and not any of my employers. Probably like many of you, when I was in school, I looked at people working at places like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and I thought to myself, wow, they must be different. They must have some innate set of skills or abilities or talents different than the rest of us mere mortals that enables them to work at these big global companies. And, you can't help but put them on a pedestal when you're in school grinding towards getting that degree and getting a job because, well, that's where everyone wants to work. There's no secret that almost all grads would love to work at a big company like that. So you start creating these mental images of people who work at those companies as if they're somehow different than you and I. And don't get me wrong, a lot of people who work at these companies are in fact brilliant, but most of them are just people who practiced and got very good at a very specific type of problem that I'll talk about in a few minutes. You can talk to almost anyone in big tech, and almost all of them will have stories of rejections before they landed their role. And I'm not talking about romantic rejections, even though that happens to a lot of us in tech too. I myself had my very first full-time job interview with Amazon right before I was supposed to graduate, and it went terribly. They asked me all sorts of questions and trivia that I had no idea how to answer. They put me on a team with other students interviewing, and we had to do a group project, and I decided to focus my time on helping other members of the group. And then later on, the interviewers told me that I should have focused more on myself and left my group members to, swim for themselves. So needless to say, I was rejected and became dejected and depressed afterwards because I thought, wow, if this is my first kind of real big interview and I failed it so miserably, then what chance do I have to work at any company in big tech? But obviously I kept trying and eventually had success. And it's not because I'm a super genius, but it's because I kind of learned that there's a playbook that all of these interviews have and a very specific set of questions and rules that you kind of have to follow to do well in them. Enter Leetcode. If you're not in tech or you're not familiar with Leetcode, it's simply a website that has programming challenges and problems that for whatever reason became sort of the de facto name for the style of questions that tech interviews will ask you. So whenever you see someone referring to, Leetcode questions or, oh, I'm practicing my Leetcode, they're really just prepping for specific programming questions. And these type of questions are centered around the subject area of data structures and algorithms, which is a very common course that almost all engineers or computer science majors will have to take at some point throughout their degree. For whatever reason, studying Leetcode became the norm for tech interviews, and especially at big tech. They take these Leetcode style programming questions and they task you to do them live during an interview. So, gone are the days of maybe your parents or your grandparents where they might walk in, shake a few hands, and ask you some questions about your experience and your resume. No, at big tech, once your resume actually gets through the screen, and typically you'll have a phone screen with HR, then you'll do maybe one technical screen. But then once you get past that point, your resume honestly has very little impact on how well you do in the interviews. It's really all about how you perform at these Leetcode style questions. They care way more about whether you get the optimal solution or not, whether you are able to do it quickly, whether you're able to talk about your answers than almost any other aspect. The tough part is it's almost impossible to do these interviews blind or without any kind of prep. And you really have to know some kind of trick, or maybe you've seen a similar pattern before to solve the questions in a short enough, 30 to 40 minute window in an interview. Because keep in mind, you're not just coding the optimal solution here for potentially a quite difficult algorithmic problem, but you have to explain it and answer all the questions that the interviewer is almost surely going to ask you about. Oh, what's the time complexity of this algorithm? Have you considered all the edge cases? What happens if I insert, a null value here? Is your code going to be able to handle that? What about your debug statements? They're going to ask you all sorts of things. And if you take the full time just to do implementation, you're not going to be able to answer any of their questions, and they're not going to have that high confidence in you. I've worked with brilliant people in big tech and brilliant people outside of big tech at much smaller or no-name companies. And a lot of those brilliant people outside of big tech wouldn't actually be able to pass even a junior level interview at big tech just because they either don't care or haven't decided to practice those very specific type of questions. And in fact, a lot of people in big tech could no longer pass the interviews that got them in there in the first place after a couple of years because they're not studying data structures and algorithms. Day-to-day work is very different. I think you can look at big tech employees as following a bell curve. Some of us are dumb, some of us are smart, and most of us fall kind of right in the middle at average. And the only difference I would say is that bell curve is shifted slightly to the right compared to other companies I've worked at. And what that means is not necessarily, everyone is a genius at big tech. I think it just means that you have less of a chance to encounter a very low performer or someone who could really drag the team down. I think the reason why big tech prioritizes these kinds of interviews is because it naturally weeds those very low performers out. It's such a long and arduous and painful process that requires you to study, requires you to know certain things, and it really does weed out people who don't want to put in that effort. So typically, I would say the average employee is slightly better at big tech companies, but not by much. To give you an idea of how grueling the interview process can be, back when I got hired at Tesla many years ago in 2016, I had to do, first of all, an HR phone screen, 2 technical phone interviews, which involved coding challenges. And then after I passed those 3 interviews, they flew me out for an on-site, which involved 1 hour of a technical presentation. So I had to talk about some kind of project I built. I talked about this robot that we made. And then all the people who watch your presentation become your sort of panel of one-on-one interviews right after that. So you then have 6 hours of one-on-one interviews with all the people who just saw your presentation. And almost every interview had kind of a Leetcode style question plus questions about my presentation. And that was just to get an entry-level job, not even that high paying in those days at Tesla. So if you're getting discouraged with rejection, I had a friend when I was growing up who would talk to every girl he saw that he found attractive, which ended up being most girls. But he would get rejected super often. And I remember asking him one time, like, man, how do you deal with all this rejection? Like, how does your ego handle it? I wouldn't be able to do that. And he just looked at me and he shrugged and he said, well, you win some, you lose some, and eventually I'll win. And that always stuck with me because it reminds me a lot of trying to get a job. It's in a lot of ways kind of like a romantic matching. You have to go through a lot of different trials and tribulations, but you only need that one yes at the end of the day. And the reality is 99% of work at big tech companies is identical to work outside of big tech companies. You're still designing systems, writing CRUD applications, creating API specs, having meetings with your boss and your team, writing quarterly reports, listening to Deborah talk about her 5 fur babies and where they went at, a forced work social event. None of that stuff changes. At the end of the day, a company is a company. Some are good, some are average, and some are bad. Some people leave, some people stay, some you'll learn lots at, and some you'll learn very little at. Just because you're at a big fanged unicorn doesn't mean you've peaked. And just because you're not, it doesn't mean you failed. It just means you're human. Thanks for listening and catch you later.